contributing members as storytellers. But before we get started, just a reminder, send us your questions throughout the discussion and Tawfiq will, Spirit will answer them at the end. You just use the chat section of your screen. And now let me introduce Carol Weisse, President and CEO of WCC. Hi, Carol.
Hi, Angela. How are you?
Doing well. Good to see you.
Great to see you.
Carol, tell us about the connection between WCC's work and WomensActivism.NYC.
There are so many connections. We're super excited to have Spirit with us today. As we thought about the work that they're doing, we thought that there was such an alignment between our respective organizations. If you think about WCC, we were started back in 1915 by women who really wanted to take the reins of important issues that affected them. The issue of the right to vote, you know, our early members were suffragists, maternal health, access to education. These were women who were advocating on issues that impacted their lives and the lives of New Yorkers. And as we think about storytelling, what we're trying to do is really lift up all voices, make sure all those voices are being heard. That's why we were so excited when we learned about this project. The idea, you know, we think back, many of you who are on with us today participated in our August table talk, where we highlighted an amazing play called Finish the Fight. Many of you watched it. And when we think about that, part of the reason that play was written is because there were so many stories that weren't being told. And it was so fun to be a part of helping just to amplify those amazing stories of these women of color who were so integral to getting the right to vote for women. And I think what we're all trying to do here today is make sure that as many stories as are told as possible. We know more voices at the table is better than fewer. Diverse voices, being inclusive of as many voices as possible. And this effort to bring up, you know, really to develop a forum for sharing those stories, what we hope is partly we'll be documenting our history, which is so important, making sure, sort of democratizing the history by making sure that everyone has a role in sharing their own story. We all get to share those stories and we also get to learn from those stories. And that's such a beautiful opportunity. I did have the chance to go in and just listen to some of those stories and, you know, and it's amazing how much we don't know. So we can only be better and more enriched by sharing these stories. And what we hope at Women Creating Change is that we can learn from them, that these will inform our work, and that together will make New York City a much better place.
Yeah, definitely. And this makes me even more excited to hear from Spirit. Hi, Spirit.
Hello, thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Leah. Thank you, Angela. Thank you, everyone involved in Women Creating Change. I'm just really excited to be among you in community this evening. Great.
We are so excited to have you with us. Spirit is the project coordinator for WomensActivism.NYC, a project spearheaded by the New York City Department of Records and Information Services to celebrate the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage in the United States. It's storytelling, it's history, it's women activists. Spirit, you grew up with storytellers and storytelling. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure, it's a very long story, but I will distill it to the best of my ability. But I'm actually from Canada. I was born and raised in Northern Ontario, Canada. And in order to understand how I ended up, you know, how my family ended up in Canada, it goes back to my parents' experience. My mother is a Black woman from Little Rock, Arkansas. My father is a white man from Southern Illinois. And they, you know, got together in college. They were members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. That's how they met. And because they were activists in their college town in Carbondale, Illinois, it was just a spirit that ran through them. And so when the Vietnam War erupted, they didn't believe in the war. And so they literally packed up their lives and moved to Canada. And so that's where they raised their families. So that's where I was born and raised, actually on a very rural farm in the middle of nowhere in Northern Ontario. And I grew up having no understanding that my very own mother, Minnie Jean Brown Trickey, was a freedom fighter who actually was among the first 9 Black students to desegregate Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957.
The Little Rock Nine.
Exactly. Actually, I have a picture right here depicting the Little Rock Nine. So I was, as a young person, I experienced discrimination myself. And so around the 7th grade, I found out my mother's story, and it infused a light in me and a passion in me and a confidence and excitement about history that has been burning bright ever since. And so that is kind of the spark that led to my current day activism.
And you also were very involved with the Ojibwe First Nation people where you lived, and I imagine were exposed to storytellers through that community as well.
Absolutely. That's a wonderful question, because it really helped shape my experience. Because so growing up, my mother, when she left Southern Illinois to leave for Canada, she was in the middle of her bachelor's degree. And so at the age of 50, when I was a young child, she went back to school to finish her bachelor's. And she decided to go into social work. And in this instance, it was Sudbury, Ontario, Laurentian University. They had a very brand new program called, it was a bachelor's in social work, but specifically Native Human Services. And so she went back to get her degree, and she literally, like, we almost got the degree along with her because she was a single parent at that time. And so she took us to all her classes, and the communities, Ojibwe in particular, communities in that particular region just literally embraced my family, and we were all one during that experience. And so, yeah, storytelling was incredibly important and enriching. And again, that was another layer. So thank you for bringing that up. That's really important to my experience.
Yeah. You have been a professional storyteller, including for the Smithsonian, and I wonder if you'd share a little bit about that.
Sure. So I never really considered myself a storyteller. It's just something that just kept coming. It was a thread that ran through all of my life experiences. And I think within the last 5 or so years, I embraced it as a part of my, kind of identity and my life's work. But I had a very wonderful career with the National Park Service. And then that led me to the Smithsonian, where I worked with the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian. And I had the golden opportunity to experience that museum and learn so much. If you're not familiar, it's one of 2 Smithsonian institutions in New York City, in Lower Manhattan at Bowling Green. That was just a phenomenal experience as well. So interpretation is part of my toolkit as well. And so I consider interpretation, like historical interpretation, to be a form of storytelling. So that was amazing, an amazing experience that I cherish.
You're also an anti-racism educator. How do you use storytelling in that work?
Yes, these are just such wonderful questions. Because I know what storytelling did to me, or provided me, gifted me with as a young person, learning my mother's story. And my mother's story was merely kind of the catalyst for learning more about the civil rights movement and falling in love with history and seeing young people of color reflected in the narrative. That just, as I mentioned before, it kind of infused a light in me. And so I try to pass that on to young people, because if you can't see it, then you can't be it. And I think about history and how underrepresented Black and Brown children are in the narrative. And so at any given opportunity, I love to educate young people, educators themselves and adults alike, about the stories of the civil rights movement and also just human rights stories in general. And I feel like they're a roadmap to this moment, and we're able to learn so much and understand so much as a result of putting the pieces of the puzzle together.
Yeah. So your storytelling has really been a vehicle for educating and for social activism, which in my mind shouldn't be separated anyway. My parents were also both storytellers, especially my father, and they were also both civil rights activists. So those are definitely both in my DNA. And your mother was a social activist, but you didn't find out about it until 7th grade?
Right.
Wow. Wow.
It's funny because my mother never sat down with her children and said, this is what I experienced.
Mm-hmm.
It came in little increments, and we all have our own story about how we found out.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it was a Disney movie came out, and they were depicting my mother. Hollywood stars were depicting my mother. So I was like, Mother, you make this sound really insignificant, but there's a Hollywood star playing you in a Disney movie, and I have questions. So the interesting thing is there are two elements to it. The first kind of layer was we were in Canada at the time, and so the first explanation is that she felt she didn't have a historical context to put it in for us.
Mm-hmm.
And then later on, because what happened is by a twist of fate, we all moved back to Little Rock, Arkansas, and I ended up working at the historic site where she desegregated the school for 10 years. And so I kind of like dragged up this really painful part of her history, but then it opened up room for 10 years of conversations. And then later on, her the more truthful, authentic explanation that she came to is because it was so painful.
Yeah.
She wanted her children to grow up feeling a sense of freedom, being aware of the reality, but also she didn't want to burden us, so to speak, with that, the weights of what she experienced.
This is so typical. People who have been in wars, Holocaust survivors of other difficult things, don't want their children and others to suffer the pain of it. What about her siblings? When you, in fact, talk about, coming full circle, ending up in her hometown, were her siblings storytellers? Did you hear family information from them?
Yeah, so what was interesting about the full circle moment of her coming back to Little Rock and then bringing some of her kids is because it became a part of our family conversation. So my granny's living room became just this hub for oral histories, like unintended oral histories for a decade. And my grandmother, interestingly, connected to what you were saying about not wanting to pass on these stories because of the pain. My grandmother never spoke to my mother about that experience. After it happened, my mother, it's a long story, but the short version is that my mother was expelled from Central High School for verbal retaliation after being hit in the side of the head with a purse. She actually left Little Rock and moved to New York and finished high school. So that literally, like when she was exiled from the school in Little Rock, she never came back for 30 plus years. So her coming back was like just this watershed for my whole entire family. And so my grandmother was able to open up about this experience. And then my aunt who was living there opened up. She still has a lot of anger and raw emotion because her big sister was taken away from her.
Yeah.
And she didn't go to Central High School as a result. She said, I will never go to that school, just because she knew the trauma that it inflicted on the family. And then my mother had two brothers, and everyone had their own way of dealing with it. But I think that, the women were more vocal about how it impacted their lives.
Yeah, that is very powerful. And now you're helping your mother with her memoirs.
Yes, very interesting process within itself. I just kind of, this happened, meaning I never set out to do it. It's just by the nature of the fact that I ended up working at the historic site, and I've been, along with my mother, my whole entire life, asking her questions. I still ask her questions, and she was writing her memoir, and it just got too difficult. So I said, maybe I can help take some of the weight off and help you write it. So still in the works.
Yep, but what a wonderful project. And you're doing this alongside this amazing project, WomensActivism.NYC. Tell us more about the initiative, the purpose of the archive, and why it's important.
Yes, so this, as I hope you can see, is kind of a natural fit in terms of the trajectory of my passion, personal and professional. I felt so fortunate to stumble across this opportunity about a year ago. The Department of Records and Information Services, the Municipal Archives for New York City, was seeking a project coordinator for WomensActivism.NYC, and all in the spirit of celebrating the women's suffrage centennial. And so when I was granted this great opportunity, I dove in head first, really excited. So just to describe it to you, if you're not familiar, the Women's Activism NYC is a crowdsourced digital archive that features women change makers and activists and everyday extraordinary women from around the globe. So it's literally like a portal on the internet where you can log on and honor a woman by telling her story. As a matter of fact, I hope I'm not putting you on the spot, but we do have one of our steering committee members, Brenda Berkman, who was probably involved in the project long before me. So Department of Records and Information Services launched this awesome campaign approximately 5 years ago, leading up to this culminating year, 2020. And so I've been involved in the project for 1 year, but over the last few years, the staff and my predecessors have collected stories from a wide variety of outreach initiatives, partnerships, friendships, etc., to contribute to the archive. And so our goal was 20,000, is actually 20,000 by 2020, because you can help us get there. I'm really excited because although we have about 7,600 on the website at the moment, we have a bit of a backlog, which is a good problem to have. So right now we're at about 8,000 stories.
That's amazing. The Department of Records, that's always such an important agency in society. I mean, even before the Egyptians, the Department of Records, you know, all this important information that's being saved for the future. And I'm interested that this project is part of the New York City Department of Records and not a history museum or an academic institution. To me personally, it says that they feel this is so important that it should be part of this agency. Do you know anything about the history of why this agency decided to embark on this?
Yeah, so from what I've been told and what I've learned over the past few years is the fact that in going through some of the records and archives, some of the staff or archivists were having, a challenging time finding stories that depict women's experiences and women's stories. And so, I know there's many national initiatives to commemorate the women's suffrage centennial, but I think those two thought processes combined were why the Department of Records thought it was so important. And it's just such a crucial agency to, our national narrative, or our local, state, and national narrative. And so what a wonderful opportunity to look at the past, acknowledge that representation is that there's a lack of representation in a variety of different areas, women of color, just looking at that gap and saying we can do something in the current day, create a living history experience where we can help shape and shift the narrative. So I think that's why it's so wonderful that it's actually part of the Department of Records, because this will become a part of our narrative going forward to inspire future generations.
I love that. I love the idea that electronically I can go to the Department of Records for a marriage license, for birth certificate information, for death certificate information, and for women activist information. I just think that's phenomenal. And do you have thoughts about how the process, how collecting these, how archiving these stories could shape activism in New York City and beyond?
Absolutely. So from my own personal experience, and also my experience working with interns or anyone who has worked on the archive, period, literally, when you go on the archive, you start to look around and you start to read these incredible stories about ordinary yet extraordinary women. And a conversation that really stood out to me with a high school intern, I had 3 interns at one point, and I asked them, so what's this experience like for you? And they were saying, usually we get the highlight reel of women's lives. Usually we see like the success and we see the glitz and the glamour and like the end result. And they were really excited, and I thought it was amazing considering they were in high school to have picked up on this. They said it seems as though the more successful women are, the more challenges and obstacles that they had to overcome. And I think that that is one of the really special elements of the archive, is that there's so much truth and vulnerability and authenticity to the stories. And I
Yeah.
was having a conversation with another professional archivist who was saying that sometimes history is frozen, even when it comes to an archive. And this creates more of a life or a livelihood around life experience and the historical record.
Yeah, it's living.
Yeah.
I love the idea of these high school students being exposed to this and hopefully being inspired. I'm sure they were. I hope you will continue to be able to have high school interns and have more kids exposed to it. Is there a way that schools will know about it and be able to tap in?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I came on the scene in the capacity of project coordinator, I was really, really excited about getting out into schools, colleges and middle schools and high schools, physically being in the schools. But, you know, we had to pivot when COVID kind of arrived. And so we have taken our experiences online, but we're still engaged with a variety of different educational institutions. And right now, the closest we are to schools is we have a story contest called Women Who Inspire Story Contest. And we have a category specifically for students, middle and high school students. So it's been really nice and fun to engage with them, enticing them to write stories and contribute to the archive, you know, because they're prizes, but also once they get into it, it's really exciting to them. So that's been one initiative that I really love.
That's great. I'm glad to hear that. Other impact that you hope these stories will have?
Yes, I think broadening the record, expanding the narrative, centering voices that have been traditionally marginalized or threatened to be erased. I think that's really important. I think that human rights is something that can arrive out of this moment and out of this project, is looking at the struggle that women and, you know, not just women, but we all go through to try to, you know, create equality for women. And so there are a variety of different things that I think are going to blossom out of the archive. And it will continue to live in perpetuity. So it's almost like taking a moment in time, but it spans from, you know, hundreds of years ago to the present day. And so I'm just really excited about thinking about a young person going to the archive and just being lit up by the possibility that exists in these women's stories, whether it's career, just personal aspirations. It's just really powerful to be able to share these stories all in one place.
That's wonderful. Are there, do you have an example of a story maybe that surprised you?
Not necessarily surprised, but I have a favorite story.
Okay.
I'd love to share it if you'd like.
Please.
It's very short, but it's just so beautiful. Just give me one quick second and I will share my screen.
Great.
So this story was written by an intern. Just, you know, this wasn't even part of her scope of duties or anything. She was working in a different department and she said she had time one day. And I had a conversation with her. Her name is Isabel. And I said, would you be interested in contributing a story? She said, well, what type of story? And I was like, well, you can go online and look at stories of people who are already written about, or you can write one about someone in your life. And she wrote about her sister.
Mm-hmm.
Megan's amazing sense of humor is the first thing you'll notice about her, next to her warm smile. Although she was only given 13 years with us, in those 13 years, she filled every day with laughs and love. Even after she was diagnosed with diffuse intrinsic pontine glioma, a rare childhood brain tumor located on the brainstem, her personality was unchanged. Megan joked with all the nurses and doctors and kept my family positive in a time that was not. Her perseverance in the difficulty that was thrown at her was and is truly inspiring. Refusing to give up. One memory that paints a picture of her wonderful sense of humor and tremendous heart was when she was asked by the Make-A-Wish Foundation if she had a wish. She could ask for anything in the world, but asked for a dozen Krispy Kreme donuts. My dad asked her if that's all she wanted, and she responded, okay, 2 dozen donuts. She ended up asking to go to the filming of High School Musical 3, but they didn't have room. When told that she wouldn't be able to go, my sister apologized for taking too long to decide. This is how my sister was: genuine, giving, hilarious, and strong. And she refused to let this terrible disease change that.
Wow. Wonderful.
I just love that story. It's just so beautiful.
Yeah. That's a wonderful tribute. I saw some of your family members in there, but I did not see you. I might have to interview you and put it in there.
That's so kind of you. You know, you bring up I'm sorry. You bring up a good point, and just to use, your graciousness as an example, it's very seldom that women write about themselves. And so we have tried a few different initiatives to try to encourage women to think of themselves as heroic, as change makers, as impactful and making a difference in their family and community. And so I just thank you for that, your generosity, but it is an interesting thing about the experience of being a woman.
Yeah, I think you're right. Is there a deadline for submitting stories?
Well, so the initial archive was implemented to try to collect 20,000 stories by 2020. And so as we're nearing the end of 2020, the project will not go on in the same vein that it has been. There won't be a project coordinator, but there will be elements of the project that live on. For example, I am inviting everyone here to submit stories about yourselves, about women in your life, women who inspire you, because the archive will still be up and accessible to contribute stories. But in terms of the, just kind of the capacity of the project, it won't be the same. So we're looking at counting down on New Year's Eve to celebrate how far we've come with the archive. And that letting the public know that the project is going to be shifting slightly and that there won't be the capacity that we've had previously, but to please encourage and welcome contributions throughout, the next year.
Okay, people, you heard that, so get cracking, whether it's from you, and certainly you should encourage your friends and colleagues and family members. Once somebody has contributed something, can it be edited? Can it be changed once the submission has been made?
Yes, from the WomensActivism.NYC side. You will not be able to edit it yourself, but I can leave you contact information for the email address, and you can contact WomensActivism.NYC and let them know about the correction, and they can change it.
Great. What are the requirements? I know that the women in the archive could be famous or completely unknown. What are other requirements?
That's, it's just if it's a woman of the past, a woman of the present. Mm-hmm. So it's merely, if you would like to honor a woman, then you can feel free, whether it's a celebrity, whether it's a public figure, whether it's your mother, your grandmother, your neighbor, your teacher. So we really want to take the concept of activism and kind of take all of the mystique or the connotation away from it. That's been an interesting challenge because there seems to be a certain connotation with that specific word. Yeah. And also with the NYC part, because it's a global archive, but the NYC part sometimes people are under the impression that it's just for New York, but it's not, it's for the globe.
Great.
So yeah,
Mita,
basically if
Mita,
you have
for
internet
example.
access.
Yes, okay,
That's,
good. I'm sorry, there's a little delay. Mita's
no.
grandmother was Haitian, and she's always been told that, you know, she was an activist in Haiti. So now, yes, Mita, you should definitely include her. This is for women globally, even though it's New York City Department that's collecting it.
Yes, please, please.
Cool.
And it can be in any language because we have a
Amazing.
translator. So
Wonderful.
that's a really cool aspect as well. So yes, just a couple frequently asked questions are about the women can be of the past and of the present. It's global and stories can be written in multiple languages. And also you can submit a photo and video, photo or video rather.
Yeah.
That's
Excellent.
kind of cool as well. If you want to make a personal video to accompany it, that's kind of neat too.
Okay, full disclosure, that's what I did.
Oh, awesome. That's so great.
So one of, I guess she's probably my number one shero is Sojourner Truth. And so I submitted a video of her. I mean, not her, obviously, she died in the 1880s, but a video about her and her life, and in particular, her activity with the suffrage movement and getting the vote for women, which she obviously never got herself. But so, yeah, and it was very easy to do, you know, I made sure that I knew what I wanted to submit in advance, including anything written. I had all of that ready. And then it was very easy to just cut and paste and to upload the video. So I do encourage folks, it was very easy to do. The website is really, really good.
That is amazing.
Yeah, oh, it was really, and it was very cool to do. And there are other people who obviously, there are quite a number of Sojourner Truth submissions, which was wonderful, and they're all different. So it was great to see different aspects of Sojourner Truth's life and her impact, depending on who was making the submission, what was important about her life to them. So it was very cool.
That is wonderful.
Are there plans to build partnerships with and maybe this has already happened, with educators, with other organizations, scholars, publications, that sort of thing, to keep uplifting these stories?
Absolutely. So the great thing about the project is that, you know, Department of Records and Information Services already has a wide network and a lot of friends and partners. So it's nice to have, you know, been able to kind of walk in with pre-established relationships. You know, Brenda being with Monumental Women, that's been a very strong partnership through the duration of the time that I've been here, but predating me as well. This partnership is amazing. I was so excited when Leah reached out to me and connected to want to talk about collaborative possibilities, and many others, universities, colleges, middle and high schools. And so, yeah, definitely, the more friends, the merrier. So absolutely.
How does the archive ensure authenticity or, you know, historic accuracy?
Good question. It's crowdsourced and open. And so we, to the best of our ability, audit the website periodically to look for, you know, anything that stands out that shouldn't be a part of the historic record. But the unique element to this experience is that, you know, I can go on right now and upload a story. And I can, you know, it can be from my personal perspective, or it could be, you know, information that I got from online. And so in a way, that is kind of the only way that we are able to do that, is on the back end, is make sure that we are, you know, the stories presented are of integrity and there's nothing that shouldn't be on there, but it's not as rigorous as Wikipedia. So there's that element to it, which makes it unique, but also it poses a challenge sometimes because we cannot guarantee, you know, without combing through the entire archive to make sure. So that's, yeah, it's a unique element of this project.
Well, that's a good learning experience too. Young people of today are being taught to check their sources and to try to triangulate, get as much information as possible and get to the real authentic truth. So it's a good piece of learning experience for them as well. I'm looking, we have some additional questions here. Is there a limit of size?
No, when I speak to friends and collaborators, writers, anyone who's interested in writing, I encourage about 400 words as a minimum, just so that we can get the heart of the story. Anything less, sometimes it's just, we want to know more. And so the story I read about Megan is about 400 words, and then there's no maximum.
Yeah. And do you have any tips for interviewing somebody for getting oral history?
Your questions are beautiful. Yes, I love oral histories.
Other people.
I love oral histories, and we actually have a one-pager that kind of gives an overview of how to conduct an oral history interview. So that's a resource that I can leave behind that would be helpful, because you could literally turn this into a really awesome experience. And you made me think of something. As a matter of fact, we have an initiative right now called Gift a Story, where I'll also put the link in the chat, where you can write a story and honor a woman by contributing to the archive and then signing or registering rather, and we will send you a certificate that will go to the person you wrote about. So it's like giving someone just this timeless, priceless gift of writing their story into history.
Wow, that's amazing. That's amazing.
So I'll put that in the chat as well.
Oh, that would be great. Thank you. Are there some common questions that you get about the stories? Things that you hear again and again as people are reading the stories and reacting?
There are the frequently asked questions that I mentioned in terms of like the scope of the archive. I'm
wondering, do you hear things like, I heard of this person, but I didn't know that she did such and such, or I don't know, are there, do you get reactions about what people are reading or the people that they're learning about?
So interestingly enough, because of COVID and having to work remotely, the nature of some of the duties of staff for the Department of Records, one of the silver linings is that they were able to help contribute stories, when time permitted. And so they indulged in the archive like on a really intensive level. And one of the comments that came out is like, oh my goodness, these women are amazing. They're doing just such magnificent things, and I've never heard of this person, and I've never heard of that person. So I think that was incredibly eye-opening. There was one other thing I was thinking about. It flew away, sorry, but if I think about it, if I think of it, I'll let you know. But I think that just so many untold stories, undertold stories. Like once you start going through the archive, it's just amazing. For example, I was working on the category Women in Radio today, doing some editing and uploading, and I was just blown away by the vastness of women in radio in the 20s and 30s. They had their own shows, they were on television, they were in the movies, they moved around the globe to take different career paths, and it was very awesome.
That is awesome, very inspiring. And do you have any tips in terms of good storytelling? Megan, the story was, it was just so touching and so genuine. And I think that intern is a very good writer. But for people who might not feel like their writing skills are that good, do you have any tips about being good storytellers in writing?
Sure. So we've actually done a couple story circles and story writing workshops.
Oh.
And when we first start out, we start out with thinking of a person who you might want to write about. And so that in itself is really interesting, because what we've noticed is if we're speaking about like our mothers or our grandmothers, our sisters, someone very close to us, that sounds incredibly daunting to try to encapsulate her life into a narrative. And it's almost so overwhelming that sometimes people just say, never mind. And so we would set out prompts to try to think on a smaller scale, like one specific memory, one recollection or something powerful or special that stands out to you about her, the impact she's had on your life, instead of trying to write a biography, because it's too much.
Yeah.
And we could never possibly take these amazing women in our lives and be able to represent them the way that we want the world to see them. Yeah, so starting small, and also like the scale too is thinking of one memory, and then building out from there. Something even funny, there are some entries that are just hilarious, and it's just based on one memory. So hopefully that's a tip that might be helpful.
That is very helpful. I wonder, I'm going to put you on the spot, but I have no problem doing that. But I wonder if I could put Katie Lobach on the spot. Katie was one of a handful of women in her medical school class. And I wonder if the two of you would be willing to do a little role play and have Spirit, just do the very beginning of an interview with her, almost an oral history about her being one of very few women in a medical class. And Katie, I did not ask you about this in advance, so I hope you'd be willing, and we'll get you unmuted. And we would be so grateful if you would do this and give people a little bit of a sense of how to start. Thank you, Katie.
Okay.
All right, Spirit.
It's a pleasure to meet you.
You as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you for being open. I know this may not be something you expected, and it may not be all that comfortable, but I hope that you can just embrace the process of just having a casual conversation. That's, to me, is at the heart of these stories. It's just real conversations. So, are you from New York?
No.
Where are you from?
I'm from Akron, Ohio.
Oh, wow. So how did you end up in New York?
Well, again, there's always a story. My mother, who was also from northeastern Ohio, but her whole life was that New York was like Mecca. She always wanted to go to New York. That was even around the time of the First World War. And she was she was in that same group of young creative people, writers, artists, and so on, who were drawn from the Middle West and other parts of the country to live in New York. So my first experience of New York was going to the 1939 World's Fair. The whole family got in the car. We drove down to New York. They rented a little two-bedroom, my sister and me and my parents. And we were there for a week, and we went to the fair, but we also went all over New York and did sightseeing. My father and I swam off of Jones Beach, first time I'd ever been in the ocean. And we got caught in a riptide, and I was swimming next to him, and I said, Daddy, we're trying to swim back to the shore. I can't seem to make any headway. And he said, well, I can't either. And the next thing we knew, the lifeguards were out there with boys, and they threw the boys to us and towed us in, and we were okay. But that was my first ocean swimming experience. So anyway, it was a wonderful week, which is a long-winded story. So then when I went to college, and I knew I was pre-med, and so I was interviewing for medical schools, and I got interviewed at Columbia. And one of the things I knew about Columbia, aside from the fact that it was obviously a very good medical school, was that they had a building on 168th Street called the Bard Hall, which was where the medical students lived. It was a big dormitory. The first 3 floors were women, and the other upper floors were for men, because back then, of course, the sexes were very much segregated by by gender. And so I heard that Bard Hall had a wonderful social life. And so when I got the admission note to Columbia, I gave up all my other interviews. I didn't even interview anymore. I just said yes to Columbia, and ended up, because I thought New York and Bard Hall and a good medical school, what more can you ask for? So that's how I got to New York.
Wow, that is amazing. So can you talk to us about, once you got accepted, then what was it like from there?
Well, when I was accepted, the Columbia had been accepting women for quite a long time. I was accepted in the late 1940s, which was right after the Second World War. And the majority of men in that class were veterans. And so they were older as a rule. So one of the things that this is just to the side, is that we heard a lot of war stories sometimes as we were socializing. But anyway, Columbia had a quota on women, so they admitted 10 women every year, 10 or 12 women in a class of 100. And they had been admitting women since the 1920s. So this was not an unusual. They'd been admitting women for 20 or 30 years already. So we were not exactly an unknown quantity when we were there. I think the main thing unknown was that so many of the men in the class had gone to all-male colleges. So they weren't used to studying or working with women. They just saw women as somebody to have a date with on the weekend. Mm-hmm. And so I and many of the other women in the class would have the experience that the weekend would roll around, one of the guys would say, well, let's go out and have a beer. So you'd go out and have a beer with the guy and you'd chat a little bit. And sooner or later, earlier or later in the conversation, we would get the question, you seem like a perfectly normal girl. Why are you in medical school? And we all laughed about it because, you just, and then you dealt with it, and that was okay. So that's a little bit like what it was like starting. But generally, the faculty they were used to having women around, and there were some very, very distinguished women on that faculty. I don't know if you've ever heard of the APGAR score, which is how newborns are evaluated right after delivery to see what their condition is. The inventor of the APGAR score was Virginia APGAR, who taught us. She was an obstetric anesthesiologist, and she invented that. And she's just one. I could name several others, but we had some wonderful role models, so it wasn't that we were feeling that we were underrepresented, even though that we were there under a quota.
In the moment, and every day you showed up, you're doing something that you're enjoying and are passionate about, but did you realize that you were making history in that moment?
I didn't really feel that we were making history. As I said, it wasn't that. I know nowadays people think people in my generation were unique, but there were a lot of women in medicine even then. There was even, as you may remember or know, there was a women's medical college in Philadelphia that graduated women. So I don't think there was that feeling of being particularly unique.
Well, I can't thank you enough. This is just beautiful. I really feel in awe of your, openness to talk about your experience, just, organically in the moment. Is there anything about your experience that you would like to leave us with?
Well, I don't know. I've been around a long time and done a lot of things over the years, so I'm just sticking with medical school. I remember one of the things we were told that the school, that school was a very elitist kind of school, as some of you may be aware, and a little bit, sometimes a little more than I cared for. And one of the things they would tell us was that, we're expecting most of you in the class to become leaders in medicine and to become professors of medicine and to be this and be that. And I think most of us thought it was a little bit much. But interestingly, of course, in my classes, well, as in other classes, there were a half a dozen people, including one Nobelist and 2 or 3 department chairs, so they weren't entirely wrong about it. So I guess that would give you some sense of the competition that you were up against too.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really moved by your story, and I'm like, your story needs to be on the WomensActivism.NYC archive. And so we have to make that happen one way or another. But thank you so much for your generosity. Thank you.
Thank you for giving me the time and the interest. You know, particularly people my age are always glad to talk about themselves and their lives. That sort of goes with the territory when you're over 80.
Well, thank you, Katie, and thank you, Spirit, also. That was such a great example. And like you said, it just starts with a conversation. It was wonderful. So, Dr. Loback, you are a pioneering pediatric advocate and public health advocate. So, if we'll get somebody to make sure your story gets on there. Thank you so much for your willingness. Well, as always, this has been an amazing opportunity to hear from an amazing person with wonderful stories and who's doing very important work. Spirit, it's been fun and inspiring. Do you have any last encouraging words to perhaps to someone who's interested in participating but hesitant?
Absolutely. I mean, I just, in that experience, just in 5 minutes, look how much of like the richness of you sharing your story. And I mean, you're so humble and kind, but I feel as though you're a history maker and a change maker and someone who has paved the path for the next generation. And so I thank you. And I look at your story and your experience and just, the experience we just had collectively as a microcosm of how, we're, as women, sometimes we're just going about our lives, having a regular day and doing what we love. And you may not realize how many lives you're touching and impacting and changing and being a part of creating ripples of change in your communities and around the world. So that's my encouragement for us all.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you to all our participants today. Much gratitude to you for joining us and sending your questions and sharing with us. We look forward to seeing you at the next WCC Table Talk Online. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.